Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Well, we are going to be talking today on the coronavirus, why Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu must not step down. We're going to be talking about the Supreme Court and their getting involved in our government, whether we're going to have one or not now or go to fourth elections, and anything else that might come up. We also invite your calls. We are live if you're listening here on sunny Monday morning, bright and early here in Israel, in the Holy Land. That means that we are live, or if it's between midnight to 1 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time, it means that we are live on Sunday night, your time. And you can call in. Our numbers are on our homepage on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. I want to quickly talk to you before the time runs out for this little introduction to the show, and that is the 3 Ds. That's what I just came up with just now before the show. Number one is I'm going to ask you all, if you love Israel News Talk Radio, donate. Donate your time by sharing us with other people. Share us on your Facebook. Share us on your social media, on your email list, with your friends, with your community, with your wherever you go to worship. Put us up on the bulletin board. Say that there's a great radio station that's free anywhere in the world at any time to listen to, called IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. Let people know about us. We're still basically a new station, and not everybody knows about us yet. And this is what you can do in order to help donate. And of course, you can also donate with your funds. If you want to buy us a cup of coffee over here. I don't have any coffee right now, by the way. I got to get a coffee during the break. But if you want to appear on our wall of fame, we would love to have you there. We have lots of different donate buttons for you for whatever budget you have, pretty much. Go to our homepage at IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com, and in our menu bar going across the page, you're going to see one slot that says donates. So please go there and do that. Also, second thing, don't be arrogant. That's the second D. If you have rules in your community to keep safe, to keep hunkered down at home, to wear masks, to wear gloves, whatever it is, don't be arrogant. Just do it, because if you're not worried about your life, someone else's life could be a challenge. And also do appreciate what you have and what is truly important. That's what this gives us time to do. We'll be right back, everybody. Don't go anywhere.
Always challenging the status quo. Hello, I'm Rod Bryant on Beyond the Matrix here at IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. I want to encourage you to listen each week, every Wednesday at the same time, for an amazing show that will challenge you, inform you, and inspire. News, views, and wisdom for the nations here on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. Don't forget, Beyond the Matrix every week, Wednesday, here on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
Biblical.
Be beautiful.
Wear your crown.
Wrapping is my crown.
Do what married Jewish women have been doing for thousands of years. Celebrate the art of head wrapping. I'm Andrea Grinberg from Rapunzel.com. We have beautiful scarves, stunning accessories, scarves for faith, scarves for healing, and scarves for fun. Rapunzel.com. That's Rapunzel with a W. Or click on our banner on the Israel News Talk Radio homepage.
Rapunzel.com. Beautiful scarves, stunning accessories paired with tutorials, support, and a vibrant community to give you everything you need to start and perfect your head covering journey.
Don't forget, join the Rapunzel community group on Facebook to see, learn, and share your beautiful wraps. That's Rapunzel with a W on Facebook.
I love Rapunzel.
I love Rapunzel.
I love Rapunzel.
Get 10% off your purchase with promo code RADIO. Go now to Rapunzel.com.
All right, so we are going to be discussing everything that's in the news right now that has to do with the coronavirus, with Netanyahu and why he must not step down. The Supreme Court's meddling in the Knesset, trying to examine right now whether they believe that if Prime Minister Netanyahu has a right even to lead due to the corruption charges that are against him. My question is, aren't you innocent until proven guilty, or is it the other way around where Netanyahu is going to have to prove his innocence before he's allowed to continue on with his life as usual and being our prime minister? And it's a question here of what the voters want. Let's not forget that people voted for the Likud. It got the most amount of votes with Netanyahu at the helm. It got more votes than any other party in the Knesset. And are the voters going to be trampled by the examinations and decisions by the Supreme Court of Israel? Well, here to tell us more about all of this, we have joining us Dr. Martin Sherman. He's the founder and director of the Israeli Institute for Strategic Studies. He's also a columnist and has published on several news media websites around the world. You can find him at www.martinsherman.org or at strategic-israel.org. Welcome to the show, Dr. Martin Sherman.
Thank you for having me back.
It's very good to have you on. And so the state of Israel right now, as many other places around the world, is in a very strange place where the economies are hit very, very hard. People are trying to scramble to get out of their homes. People want to get back to quote-unquote normalcy. And in the United States, we don't even know whether there'll be elections because that's supposed to come up in November. And they still say that people cannot come together. So we don't know what's going on over there. Here in Israel, it's very similar. Just like you've got the anyone but Trump, you've got here the anyone but Bibi. And now the Supreme Court is trying to come in and say, well, we're going to have a say here, whether this agreement that was signed between Benny Gantz and from the left and Netanyahu from the center right is going to be accepted and can go on to make a government, or whether they're going to say Netanyahu is not allowed to serve as a prime minister until he's proven innocent. What do you have to say about all of this?
Well, first let me say something about Corona. I'm certainly not an expert in the field of epidemiology, but I think it would be, if it were my decision, I would err on the side of safety. If you look at countries like Sweden, who try to ignore some of the safety procedures, with roughly the same population as Israel, they have over 10 times the number of deaths. And if you look at Austria, they have 2.5, almost 3 times the amount of deaths. So
I want to interrupt you for a moment because I want to make a comment on what you said. And you're talking about Sweden. And, in Europe, I can see that their value for their elderly is not the same as it is here in our culture here in Israel. And in many countries, they would even, I hate to say this, but I would not be surprised if they are welcoming the deaths of their elderly because it's less Social Security that they have to pay out to their people. The elderly population now is a bit, wanting to collect their dues that they've paid all their lives, and now the government won't have to pay that out. And it's just fine for those governments. What do you have to say about that?
Well, I'm not sure that that's the motivation, but there certainly is a much higher sensitivity towards human life in Israel than almost any other country in the world. In Europe, it's not as if they have a lot of youngsters to replace the old. In many countries, there's almost static, in some cases, decreasing population. So, if you're going to kill off your older population, you will have. You might not have anyone to replace them. So
well,
I'm not sure. I'm not sure that I would like to impart those motivations to them. But
okay.
there's a serious problem with pensions and things like that.
All right, we won't go there. Fine.
Of the aging population, by the way, in Japan as well. But I'm not sure that we should impart motivations to them. Although, as I say, there's a certain amount of logic to what you say.
Okay, so keep going. Go ahead. I interrupted you. Go.
There's been a lot of criticism of the handling here, but as I say, as a non-expert, I certainly my instincts say let's err on the side of caution rather than take risks. And I think the statistics bear that out. As I said before, in Sweden, although the population there is older than the population here, and the temperatures are not quite as high, there are almost over 10 times the amount of death on a roughly comparable population. In Austria as well, there are almost 3 times the amount of death. If you look at the UK, the fatalities per population are huge compared to Israel. They've had almost 30,000 deaths compared to which is almost 100 times what we have here on a population that's about 7 times the size here. So,
and would you attribute all of this to being inept, or would you attribute it to being where your values are, whether it's weighing between the economy's livelihood or human livelihood?
No, I'm not sure. I don't know what motivated the governments there. The British certainly had a 180 turnaround. They started off trying to induce herd immunization. And ended up switching that. The Swedes seem to have carried on with their own liberal and lenient policy. And if you're looking at the number of fatalities, it doesn't seem to have worked that well. But I think that by and large, the situation was well handled here by the Israeli government. It's perhaps easy for me to say because I live in a small, very well organized community where people are not confined to apartments on the 10th floor. But I think that the decision making by and large has been correct. We'll see what happens now as the restrictions are lifted, and perhaps in a few months' time when the weather turns colder, what happens.
But so far, you believe that the Prime Minister is doing a good job?
All in all, I think he is, and you see this reflected in the surveys. Recent surveys are showing that the Likud is polling comfortably above 40 mandates, and his opponents have been completely
decimated,
dispersed, and decimated.
Yeah.
Even without blue and white. In the last poll that I saw, that the right-wing bloc has grown from 58 to 65. So it seems that he hasn't done anything dramatically wrong in the eyes of the electorate, and they're increasing their support for him. Now, which probably brings us to the second topic that you wanted to talk about, is the Supreme Court, which I think in many ways is a very serious issue. I think over the years, by its actions, the Supreme Court has eroded public trust radically in its decision-making process. And that in itself is a very dangerous development, because it's true that the Supreme Court should be the cornerstone of law and order in Israel, and if the public has no faith in it, that really endangers and imperils public order in the country. I think Aaron Barak will go down in history as someone who inflicted great damage on Israel society.
He was the head of the Supreme Court, everybody, if you don't know who Aaron Barak is. Okay.
And he introduced this concept of an activist court. In other words, taking on many issues which probably in the judicial world around the globe wouldn't be considered the purview of courts.
We're going to go to a break in another minute and a half, but I want to say this is that I want to ask you this, and maybe you can answer it after the break. The Supreme Court is coming in, perhaps, I don't know, stretching its arm a little bit too far by sticking its fingers in the pie of what's going on inside the Knesset when an agreement was already signed. And though a lot of people are unhappy with that, it's still what the voters voted for. They voted for those politicians to lead them, and they made an agreement. Those are the Knesset members that they wanted, represented by the public. And now the Supreme Court's going to come in and say something different. And I want to ask you for the next segment, who is it that will enforce the decision of the Supreme Court? Because we have some decisions by the Supreme Court that the Knesset and the police do not enforce, like the rights of Jews to pray in the Temple Mount. The Supreme Court said Jews have a right to do it, but we don't see it done. The Supreme Court says certain communities have to be destroyed, especially if it's an Arab community, and for the public interest, they don't do it. So who's to say which decisions by the Supreme Court are honored and enforced and which aren't, and what they can do here and who's going to enforce it? So we'll talk about this when we get back from the break. If you want to call in, weigh in on the issue, have a question, have a comment, feel free to call in. Our numbers are on our homepage at IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. We'll be right back.
Shalom, everybody. Making a difference often takes just one moment and one person at a time. I am Orly Benny Davis, your show host on Israel News Talk Radios from Jerusalem with Love. You'll be hearing people talking about politics, religion, social issues, and making a better tomorrow. Join me, Orly Benny Davis, for God and Country. From Jerusalem with Love.
Wednesdays on Israel News Talk Radio.
All right, we're back here at the Tamar Yonah Show on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. Our guest is Dr. Martin Sherman. He's the founder and director of the Israeli Institute for Strategic Studies. And we are talking about why Prime Minister Netanyahu must not step down. However, we have the Supreme Court of Israel, which is now meddling in the Knesset and perhaps could try to cancel the agreement signed between the left and the right Knesset members, led by Benny Gantz and led by Benjamin Netanyahu. And my question to our guest before the break was, who is there to enforce the decision of the Supreme Court? Because some decisions are enforced and some aren't. So I'm at a loss here. How can you answer that for us, Dr. Martin Sherman?
The first thing to remember is that the Supreme Court doesn't have an air force, so it doesn't really have the
ground troops.
It doesn't have the coercive power to compel people to, or especially a government, to comply with decisions. We saw this recently in both directions. The decision with the High Court actually gave permission to demolish the Bedouin village just near Jerusalem in Rachma, and it hasn't been imposed, I think, because of the lack of political resolve. On the other hand, when they directed the Knesset Speaker Edelstein to convene the Knesset to re-elect his replacement, and he refused, basically resigned. That also showed that they don't really have the power to compel. But the only real weapon that the Supreme Court has is the respect that it commands in Israeli society, and I think it's done a very good job in undermining that respect. There was a book that came out at the beginning I think the end of the last decade, from printed at the Harvard University Press, a very prestigious press, by Dr. Ron Herschel, who said then that the Supreme Court is eroding the public trust in it by overturning regularly decisions of majoritarian mechanisms like the Knesset, and has been perceived as promoting its own worldview and perspectives and values rather than the letter of the law. There's an ongoing study at Haifa University which shown a dramatic erosion in the credibility that the Supreme Court has in Israel, falling from something like 80% a decade or so ago to something around half now. In other words, half the Israeli population does not have much confidence in the Supreme Court, especially when it comes to political matters. Because in many ways, unfortunately, we've seen that the Supreme Court ignores existing legislation, like, for instance, the disqualification of Arab lists, where there is a clear violation of the letter of the law, where the basic law, Knesset, says that any party or any individual who denies Israel's existence as a democratic and Jewish state cannot participate in the elections, and anyone who identifies with an enemy state or a terrorist organization cannot. And there are there's clear evidence that nearly every component of the joint list and the joint list itself
that's the Arab parties
with that law.
For anybody who doesn't know,
does not comply with that, and yet the Supreme Court time and time again overturns the decision of the Central Elections Committee of the Knesset, who's voted to bar them, overturns that decision. On the other hand, it's upheld decisions or even appeals, not even decisions, appeals from outside factors to bar Jewish participants, not on what they say overtly, but when they deny the allegations, and the Supreme Court interprets their motives to bar them. So on the other hand, on one hand, you have clear violation of the letter of the law, undisguised and unmasked violations of the law, which are being overlooked. And on the other hand, you're having violations more or less being invented despite the denials of the defendants. So this is very troubling. And in the case of the current hearing, there should be no hearing at all, because the basic laws are very clear. You can argue whether they're worthy or have merit or not, but the law says that the Prime Minister can continue to function in his position until there is a final, after the final appeal has been dealt with, can continue to act as Prime Minister. And if 61 members of the Knesset vote or recommend a member of Parliament to be Prime Minister, he should be given the ability to establish the government. It doesn't say that the 61 members have to judge whether he's worthy morally, or if there's any moral turpitude associated with him, or if there's any criminal charges pending. There's no such conditions. But even if you think that morally there's some blemish for someone running for Prime Minister, if he has indictments against him, I think in the Netanyahu case, this is different, because the charges against Netanyahu are so transparently contrived. I think any layman with common sense who looks at the indictments against Netanyahu says, even if they're all true, so what? So over a decade, he took an inappropriate amount of champagne and cigars from one of his well-heeled buddies. So if there should be any sanction, surely that would be administrative and not criminal. It wasn't as if these were concealed, or whether untoward benefits were given for these gifts. So that's the one thing. The other charge of conniving with the editor of Yediot Achronot to get favorable coverage was an agreement that was never implemented. In fact, quite the opposite was. 43 members of the Knesset voted for what the editor of the Yediot Ahronoth wanted. Netanyahu opposed. None of those 43 members have been indicted for improper behavior. So there certainly seems to be very selective prosecution here. The other more serious charge, serious in terms of the legal aspect, but certainly seems to be very flimsy in terms of factual corroboration, is the corruption charge with the Walla organization, where he is supposed to have bestowed benefits on the owner in exchange for favorable coverage again. In my opinion, borders on the
absurd,
on the fringes of the absurd, because it's very difficult to see what favorable coverage he's got, because Walla basically is a very anti-Netanyahu vehicle, many lawyers, international lawyers, prominent international lawyers, have said there's never been a case in the Western world where favorable coverage has been considered the quid pro quo for bribery in the case of a politician. That's what politicians do all the time. They want to be re-elected, and so if you're going to abstract the give and take relationship within politics, you basically you're going to you're going to neutralize the whole process. And as people have said before, every time someone gets interviewed, he's going to have to think whether he's going to be up for criminal charges if he's going to get favorable coverage, and the news vehicle as well will have to think, how it's going to cover the story every time it interviews a prominent public figure, because there'll always be some nagging fear that they may be indicted because the coverage was, in the eyes of the law, too favorable. So the charges against Netanyahu, in my opinion, are going to have very, very detrimental effects, particularly on the establishment, the law and order establishment here, because no matter what the outcome is now, half the population is going to be dissatisfied. If he is convicted, half the population, his supporters, are going to be extremely suspicious and bitter, and think that the law in Israel has been used as a political weapon. And if he's acquitted, the other half is going to think that this is a result of corruption. So I think these charges are going to boomerang on the people who've brought them forward.
You mean like the Supreme Court judges? Is that what you mean?
Well, in the case of Netanyahu, the Supreme Court hasn't been involved yet, but certainly the other law enforcement agencies, like the police and the state prosecution, I think are going to have a very difficult time with the repercussions.
All right. Well, we're headed for another break right now, but when we get back, I want to ask you, what do you think will happen and what do you think should happen if indeed the Supreme Court decides that Netanyahu should not have the ability to rule and should have to go to trial first? Because I'm very interested in what you think about that. And again, if anybody has any comments or questions, feel free to phone in. Our numbers are on our homepage at IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. We're going to be right back, everybody. Don't go anywhere.
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
This is Shai Ben-Tekoa, and each week I'll be webcasting to you from Judea, origin of the word Jew, a people besieged and beleaguered in every generation. Nazi Germany's but a memory, but in its place the world invented the phantom Palestinians as this generation's internationally authorized Jew killers. Tune in for a different slant on life in Israel, Phantom Nation, every Monday.
Hi, I'm Rabbi David Aaron. The soul basics are the most profound, the most essential and yet often the most neglected in our education. Join me for Soul Talk on Israel's News Talk Radio and discover the secrets to love, spiritual growth, and personal power.
All right, we're back here at the Tamar Yonah Show on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. Our guest is Dr. Martin Sherman, and we're talking about why Netanyahu must not step down. He wrote an article about this. You can go and find that on different media websites around. He's published in widely the Jewish press and I believe Arutz Sheva, other places as well, and of course on their website, the Israeli Institute for Strategic Studies, or strategic-israel.org. My question before the break, Dr. Martin Sherman, was what do you think will happen if indeed the Supreme Court makes its decision after its inquiries that Netanyahu does not have a right to lead the government until he goes to trial, until he's proven innocent? What do you think will happen? What do you think should happen?
Well, I think that would be an earthquake decision here. And the truth of the matter is I'm rather skeptical that they'll do that, because in this case, even people who normally support the Supreme Court very solidly, many of the major media figures, are beginning to have doubt. People who've been strongly against Netanyahu, for instance, like Raviv Drucker, who's a well-known investigative reporter here, have been expressing their doubts. In fact, they were very worried that the Supreme Court may make such a decision. And they're saying that the Supreme Court has no legal hook to do that. Even Blue and White, I understand, put out an announcement saying that the Supreme Court cannot or should not interview and will have serious repercussions if they do. So I think that the Supreme Court is beginning to understand that it's overstepped its mark. If you ask what should happen, I think that the Supreme Court should dismiss the charges against Netanyahu very swiftly. People like Alan Dershowitz called on the Attorney General before the indictments were made to drop the charges, because I think nothing will bring about greater danger to the forces of law and order here than to continue with this. And if you look at it, these investigations have cost tens of millions of shekels to conduct for charges that it's very difficult to see where the damage to the public interest was. I'm not quite sure what breach of trust there is in Netanyahu accepting cigars and champagne. How did this actually harm the public interest? Or whether he had a discussion with Noni Moses, the editor of the Yediot Ochronot, about certain arrangements between them, which actually never came to fruition. Where is the harm against the public interest? And the same thing with the Bezek. One might argue as to the prudence of the arrangement that was reached, and if that actually promoted or held back the communication sector here. But basically, it's very difficult to see where the gross harm to public interest has been inflicted. If you want to see real corruption, have a look at South Africa, where the heads of government there have amassed massive fortunes, hundreds of millions of dollars, and the public sector is falling apart. There's a country which once had a surplus of energy that now has perennial outages. The health system is falling apart. There's huge spread of HIV across the country, and inequality is growing like completely out of control. If you want, the the epitome of corruption, that's South Africa. It's certainly, worlds apart from what we have in Israel and Netanyahu. So, if you ask me what I think should happen, I think these charges should be dismissed swiftly before they inflict any more damage. Whether Netanyahu should carry on as prime minister for all eternity is another question. No one is really that irreplaceable, but he certainly towers above any of his prospective.
Yeah, but you know what? That doesn't make any difference whether you believe he towers above or not, or I believe it. What matters is the voters. And the voters voted the Likud in with him at the helm, and they got the most votes than anybody else got. And it's up to the voters. So let me ask you this question, because we're running out of time, and I really want to understand this. So if the Supreme Court should decide that he cannot lead the country until he goes to trial, meaning that you have to prove your innocence. You're not, you're not innocent until proven guilty. Rather, you have to prove your innocence. What would happen? Do you think that Netanyahu, do you think that he can refuse to stand down?
I think it would be a very difficult situation. I mean, I'm not sure that the mobs would take to the street and tear down the Supreme Court. But it certainly would be a crisis of confidence on nearly all the public institutions in Israel. And I think in many ways that would cause a disintegration of the current system of law and order. I don't think anyone would give any credence to it. And by the way, the massive support that Netanyahu has now in the public, in the polls, where he leads any of his nearest rivals by a comfortable margin as who's most suited to be prime minister. I think this is a huge vote of non-confidence in the Israeli legal establishment, and they really should pay attention to it, because the legal establishment here, as I said, they don't have their own air force, they don't have their own artillery. The only weapon that they do have is the respect they command, much like your previous guest said, that people are only prepared, the Constitution is only as strong as the people's will to defend it. That's very analogous here. People only respect the judiciary only has power so long as people are prepared to accept its authority. But if it abuses its authority, as it seems that it is now, I certainly think that it's endangering its position in society.
So you're saying that if the Supreme Court should rule that in their decision is that the prime minister cannot continue as prime minister until he goes to trial, you're saying that there could be, nobody knows, but you're saying that there could be a revolution.
I certainly think that there would be a rebellion against the Supreme Court, because, by the way, if they decided that, it would go against the letter of the law. When the letter of the law says the prime minister can continue in office until there is a final decision, a post-appeal decision against him, and then if 61 members of parliament, unconditionally, there's no condition on it, if 61 members of parliament or more recommend a prime minister, a candidate for prime minister to the president, he has to assign him the task of putting the government. So I think a decision like that would be against the letter of the law, and basically you would have a lawless Supreme Court, which is almost something that is unsustainable.
Wow. All right. Well, we only have about 2 minutes left. What would you like to leave us with?
Well, I think we're at a crossroads now. I think there's been a growing awareness in the public that the Supreme Court is basically endangering the public confidence in it, and you see this, as I said before, in the attitude of the leading media personalities who are important in shaping public opinion here, who are basically stepping away from their vehement anti-Netanyahu stance and expressing doubts whether the Supreme Court can actually take any action on this and whether it should. So I think we might be on the cusp of a new societal arrangement between the Supreme Court and the political system here. Let's hope things get better. I think important work has been done, both by Ayelet Shaked and particularly by Ohana, the current Prime Minister, in standing up to this legal dictatorship. And let's hope this continues.
Do you think that the coronavirus saved Netanyahu in the sense that it has made him more popular in the country because he's taken charge and he's pretty much looked at as done a pretty good job? Do you think that it has saved his political career?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I think many people have been criticizing Netanyahu as being too severe with the restrictions. I actually think that, in an uncertain world, you should err on the side of safety, because you never know if you're taking exactly the right decision, and so you should be careful, because the thing could easily have got out of hand. So I think there's a certain amount of credit, but I think in many ways his performance in other fields are becoming to light, and the comparison with his rivals, I think, has been one of the things that have boosted his popularity. And we've seen Gantz and the Lapid in not a very positive light. They've lost a lot of support. So I think it's a combination of factors. I'm not sure that the coronavirus is something that's tremendously boosted him that much. I think he's done a good job, as I said, because a lot of people are having a difficult time because of it, and whether it's justified or not, they may try and blame the government for the unemployment and the loss of income and too severe. So I'm not sure that the coronavirus has been a very significant factor in boosting his popularity. Although, interestingly, bringing enough, Eric Ioffe, the former head of the reform movement in the US, a very anti-Netanyahu critic, said that at the moment Netanyahu is all we have against the coronavirus. So even he conceded that it was just as well that Netanyahu is at the helm at the moment. So, perhaps you have a point there.
We'll have to hold it there. Thank you so much, Dr. Martin Sherman, for coming on the show. You can find him at strategic-israel.org. Thank you. Very interesting show. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamar. And good day to the listeners.
Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. Just click the orange button at the top of the IsraelNewsTalkRadio.home page, log in as yourself or an anonymous guest, and join in on the fun. You'll meet other listeners from all over the world who listen to Israel News Talk Radio, and you can make new friends. Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. It's the closest you can get to being in the studio with us.
We love listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Where can you get the inside news on Israel? At Israel News Talk Radio, we're dedicated to sharing Israel's inside story with the world by providing our listeners with news on Israeli politics, current affairs, and Israeli Jewish culture. The Israel News Talk Radio homepage also provides you, the listener, with useful information at your fingertips, with scrolling news headlines, weather, currency exchange, Shabbat candlelighting times, and so much more. Our radio programming is always accessible and on demand. We operate absolutely free of charge for everyone, everywhere. If you love what we do, partner with us now by becoming an Israel News Talk Radio supporter. With your support, you'll be inscribed on our Israel News Talk Radio Wall of Fame. There's nothing like us in the world. Be part of something great. Israel News Talk Radio. Straight talk from Israel.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.